Okay, John chapter 11. We didn't meet the last couple of weeks. We didn't meet last week or the week before. We stopped at the idea that Jesus was standing outside the cave, outside the tomb, rather. It was a cave, but they called it a tomb. And he said, Lazarus, come. And I left you with the idea that in your mind, picture how that happened, because he was wrapped up. Some say, well, he wasn't wrapped up too bad, so he could walk. I don't know. He was wrapped up pretty good, you know. And he had the face covering on and all that stuff. And Jesus said, go, take the wrappings off him, take the face covering off him. One thing I'm going to ask when I get to heaven is, Lazarus, of course, I would have experienced it too at that point, wouldn't I? It won't matter. There you go. There you go. But you wonder, what was he talking about? What was it like? You know, what was his message? His message was so strong that we learn in chapter 12 they want to kill him. They don't want to kill just Jesus. They want to kill him as well. Patrick told me a couple weeks ago that, in fact, he goes on to live, 40 years? 40 more years? Traditionally. What message is that he would have? Can you imagine that? Having lived through that, what message would he have about the gospel? What would he do? What would he stand up in front of the congregation and talk about? And I say that because each of us have a story to tell. Each of us has experienced the grace of God in different ways, but we've experienced it. We're like Lazarus. Well, granted, we didn't sit in the tomb for 4 days, and we weren't wrapped up, but still life created that within us. Why are we so quiet? Why are we so silent about what God has done in our life? What is it that we're afraid of? Is it because we don't know how to articulate that? Is it because we're afraid of being persecuted for that? And I think what really disturbs me most is, why can't we talk about it with other Christians? More than anything else, I should be able to trust you with my story. Now, there are parts of my story you will never know. But know this, that though I was dead in my sins, I'm now alive in Christ. And my life doesn't start when I get to heaven. It starts the day I was baptized. Now, I was baptized in a lake in April up in Massachusetts. Cold. And when I went down in the water, my lungs collapsed because of the coldness. Boom. When I came up, I was gasping for air. I really did die. I don't suggest you get baptized in cold water in April in Massachusetts. Thank goodness we have the convenience of warm baptistries here. But you know, we need to be able to tell our stories, regardless of how imperfect our lives are. And we should never care about the imperfections of another person. Never question. To be able to talk about our own imperfections is very important, because there are many who struggle in life like we do, who need to hear our story. Lazarus was alive for 40 years for a reason, and that's because he could tell his story.
I was going to say, a lot of it, I think, is because we think we're the only one. We're the only one that's ever done that, or we're the only one that's ever sinned in this way, because we don't talk about it with our brothers and sisters, and so we're caught in this little box of, it's only me,
Yep.
I'm the only one.
If you ever feel that way, by the way, just remember me. All right? And you just remember how God rescued me, he can rescue you. John says something very important in 1 John. He says, if you sin, ask God for forgiveness. And he will cleanse you of all unrighteousness. Now, there are many this year who are experiencing this holiday probably for the first time without a loved one, a loss. And so be very sensitive, but also understand that they need a hug. Okay? They need a hug. Because it is very difficult. Especially we can't help but turn on the television, everybody's finding love. Everybody's getting married. And all the Hallmark stories. Well, I wish life was a Hallmark story, but it's not. Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Did I not tell you? He's talking to Martha, who questioned him. If you were only here, my brother would be alive. You know, that's not just Martha's question, that's our question. If Jesus is really here, why am I suffering the way I am? If Jesus is really here, if you're really here, Jesus, if you really do the things that you said you're going to do, why are we going through this? What is the deal with this pain and suffering? Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? The glory of God is displayed in each one of us. Don't ever forget that. Thank you, Jerry, for bringing that subject up. All right. So they took away the stone. Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me. That is speaking to Martha. Because remember when Martha first saw him, she said, we know that God hears you. This is a message of comfort for Martha. He wants Martha to be comforted by his very prayer. He didn't have to pray this. He could have let Martha do what she was going to do and have the faith. He wanted to strengthen her. Strengthen her faith. And so, behave yourself. Behave yourself. But I think that's such an important story. Part of the story. I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. You know, as an evangelist or as a preacher, I always miss that point. I want people to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I want people to believe Jesus is the Messiah. But I've never preached a sermon on believing that God sent him into the world. And I'm sorry for that, because that's Jesus' whole message to his earthly walk, was to get people to believe that God had sent him into this world. The focus is on God the Father with Jesus, not on himself. And I wish I could always say that. And maybe from now on, we need to work that into our preaching and our teaching. That it was the Father who sent Jesus into the world. Our task is just not to get people to believe in Jesus and get them into the baptistry. It is to tell them that God sent him into this world for a purpose. And that's our goal. That's our task. That's our message. That Jesus is here because God is faithful. And he promised us from the very beginning that he would rescue us. And he will. And when he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died, John wants to make this point clear, he was not resuscitated. He was dead. his hands and feet bound with linen strips. Could you imagine that? Close your eyes and just imagine this mummy coming out. And his face wrapped with a cloth. So he's real. Unbind him and let him go. Now, some people say, he walked out. But no, listen to it. Unbind him and let him go. That is such an important statement. Because that is what happens at our baptism. We are unbound by sin. And whatever you hear about baptism, and I know sometimes we think of it just as a ritual, something we have to do, much more than that. When we're baptized, God says, unbind him and let him go. Freedom, liberty, freedom from ourselves. God is going to rebuild us. He's going to continue to unwrap us over and over again so that we can go and let him go. Let us experience life as it's supposed to be. Unbind him. You see, John's words are so pregnant with meaning. Can I say that word? Pregnant with meaning. And sometimes we gloss over it or move on. Oh, well, unbind him means to take them up. No, it's such significance there. Think about your life and the freedom that you have to be what God had created you to be. You know, we talked about joy this morning. And this is what joy is all about. That God is remaking us, every single one of us. He's remaking us into what he created us to be. He's unbinding us. Am I joyful of my present physical condition? Well, no. But there's one thing I know. It's that God is walking next to me and with me. That I do not face my imperfections alone. There is nothing under heaven and earth. There is no sin. There is nothing, life and death, that can separate you from the love of God. Think about that. There's nothing. I'm going to say this and we get in trouble, I know. Even suicide cannot stand between that young man and God's love. Cannot. That's the honor of God in this story. That's the glory he displays. Many Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. I don't know how you could not believe in what you saw. I don't know. But many of them did. You know, in the other examples, it was always some of them believed, and many of them did not. But notice the flip John makes here. That's the impact Lazarus' story had. That's the impact of that life of Lazarus had. So much of an impact, as we're going to learn in 12, that they wanted to kill him, get rid of his testimony. But some of them went to the Pharisees. Now, I'm not sure, whether they went because they didn't believe or they went because they wanted to make a testimony to the Pharisees, like the blind man. I don't know. So the chief priests and Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs." What's the significance in signs in the Hebrew culture, in the Old Testament culture? What was the significance of signs? Why were they always asking Jesus for signs? What was so significant about the signs? Because the signs proved God's involvement. It proved that God was acting in the world. And that was why they were asking for signs. And so here they are recognizing these signs, but they can't see God in the signs. They are blinded, or they recognize it and reject it. Either one of those. But they recognize the signs. What are we to do? What are we to do? Interesting question. I think that has more to do with John's audience and with us today than it did with the Pharisees. What are we to do with Jesus' signs? What are we to do? How does this change us tomorrow? What do we take with us today that gives us strength and courage to meet tomorrow? What are we to do? If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. As if there it is. The Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. There you go. That's their motivation. They want power. Do you know why the Sanhedrin met in the temple? Do you know why they did that? Because the Roman soldiers were not allowed to go there. They were not allowed to enter the temple. So that's why they always met in the temple, because the Roman soldiers were not allowed in there. And they could connive, and they could teach, and they could do all these things free from the Romans. Then one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, to be a high priest, you had to pay Caesar. To be a local priest, you had to pay Caesar. That's why the priests had such power in the Roman world, because they had money. That's why their temples were always gathering money so they could pay Caesar off. So that year, Caiaphas paid Caesar off to be high priest. All right? So every year that tax came due. That's why it says the high priest in that year, Caiaphas. I'm not sure whether Caiaphas is part of Aaron's lineage. I don't know. But I do know that he got money. He had money. And he paid for that privilege. But he says, nor do you understand it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. Interesting statement. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. Jesus died for the nation. He died for us. We are part of that nation. As Paul would say, we are transplanted into the people of God as Gentiles. Die for the whole nation. It's funny how the Holy Spirit works, isn't it? It doesn't just work through Christians. It works through others as well. And I think that's interesting that John brings this out to his church, that they remember it wasn't the Pharisees or the Romans who put Jesus to death. I mean, they did. Don't get me wrong. But that was always in God's plan. Always in God's plan that he would die. And now he places something very significant. And not for the nation only, but also to gather into the children of God who are scattered abroad. Unity is the message of the church. Unity. We're all unified with one another because Christ died, because of his death. He wants to make that perfectly clear because there is some struggle here in the first century church between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, each one thinking they're better than the other one. And some today still feel the same way. That somehow certain Christians are better than other Christians. I have a dear friend. I love him to death. But he doesn't have as much patience with new and weak Christians than I do. And we argue about that all the time. I don't care if you got 1 ounce of faith. I said this in my Thursday class. I want to say it right here. If there's one thing that I want you to know about me and my message is this. It doesn't matter how much you know. It doesn't matter how much you do. What matters is how big your heart is for God. Because if your heart is big enough for God, you're going to do what is right. And you're going to seek out God. Focus on your heart of God, for God. It's not how much you know. It's not how much you do. It's about how big your heart is for God. And it doesn't matter. Each of us is going to be different. Jerry's heart is for God is much bigger than mine. Thank goodness. I'm joyful for that one. People's hearts are all going to be different sizes. And we should never judge someone's heart by the basis of our own. Oh, it should be harder. Should be harder. No, it should be what it is. And God is at work getting that heart better. And they made plans, and from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with his disciples. There is a specific time Jesus is going to enter Jerusalem, but he can't do it just now because they're going to seek him out first. So he has to go. But he also goes to get ready. He also goes to consecrate himself, to get ready for what he's about to do. Now, next week, we're going to finish up with chapter 12, and that'll finish us the first half of the Gospel of John. We'll come back to the second half of the Gospel of John later on in the year. But I wanted to get through the first section first, because that's the most important section. That's the section of this.